Welcome to Speaking with Confidence. My name is Kat Matson, and on this podcast, I coach business owners, public servants, humble leaders, and the people I generally call corporate hippies how to speak with authority, confidence, authenticity, and impact so they can make their dent in their universe. Welcome back. If you are a regular listener, it's lovely to have you here. And if this is the first ever Speaking with Confidence episode you are tuning into, welcome. Welcome. It's fabulous to have you here and to almost meet you. Today's episode, How to Write a Speech. This came from Tamara in one of my Facebook communities when I asked the question, what would you like me to cover in upcoming podcast episodes? And she said, help. I have no idea where to start when it comes to writing a speech. How would I even begin? Now, it's interesting, isn't it? I think writing a speech can induce almost as much fear. You know what? I don't know what induces as much fear as writing a speech. It's the worst kind of speaker's or writer's block because not only do you need to come up with something to say, you're also faced with all of the nerves of, I'm going to have to say this. So this is such a ripper of a question. Thank you, Tamara. So I'm going to answer this in the most simplest of ways. Where do I start? Well, you start with the end. Beautiful Stephen Covey, who wrote the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, his habit number two of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is begin with the end in mind. And it is exactly the same place that I recommend that you start when writing a speech. What is the outcome? What is it that you want your listeners, your audience, to think, to feel, to believe, to do, to know as a result of hearing this speech? Now, there are so many different types of speeches. It could be a eulogy. It could be a 21st birthday speech. It could be a wedding speech, or it could be more professional. It could be a speech that you deliver at a networking event or a speech to ask for more funding for your project. There are so many different types, but in every single one of those types, where you start is the same, the end. What do I want my listeners to feel, to think, to know, or to do as a result of hearing this speech? Now, if you haven't read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I highly recommend that you do, just because it's probably one of the standout personal development books of all time. I revisit that book on a regular basis every couple of years, and I still use a lot of the teachings in my life as well as in my day-to-day time management. To get more information too on this whole beginning with the end in mind, go back to one of my earliest episodes, episode number 6. It is literally called Beginning with the End in Mind. And I talk all about how do you start your speech or how do you start your presentation prep from this place of where do I want to take my listener. Now, once you've identified where you want them to be, you then need to ask yourself, well, where are they now? What do they currently think, feel, know, or believe or do about this particular topic? Now, obviously, in a personal sense, whether it's a eulogy or a 21st or a wedding, this is a slightly different context. But if it's a professional presentation, if it's asking for budget, if it's trying to get people to come on board with a change management program, then you can ask yourself, well, what's the gap? What's the gap between where I want them to be and where are they now? And then, because you've only got space in any presentation, any presentation for 3 key messages, you then ask yourself, well, what are those 3 key messages? What is it that I need to land to deliver in order to move them from where they are now to where I want them to be? Now, the reason we've only got 3 key messages is because, well, there's a whole lot of reasons. There's a whole lot of reasons. One is because we're already distracted. 2, because the human mind can only deal with so many chunks of new information at any one time. And so when we try to give people more than 3 key messages, then we just overwhelm, and it's just like pouring water into an already full glass. One of the things that often happens at this point is when people realize that they've only got 3 key messages and they want to take their listeners to a certain point, and yet they ask themselves where they are now. Sometimes what can happen is that they realize that that is too big a gap. And so they need to adjust their expectations about where they're going to be able to take their listener. The answer, by the way, is never, never, ever, ever in putting in more information in order to squeeze it into 3 key messages with a whole lot of data. Instead, you actually have to go up and go into more generalized principles. But that's a conversation for another time. I talk more about the power of key messages in a previous episode, episode number 25, the power of key messages. And you can listen further into why we only have 3 and how to articulate what your key messages are. Of course, I'm going to pop all of the links to these show notes, all the links to these other episodes in the show notes. So back to tomorrow's questions. Where do I start when writing a speech? Well, you identify where you want your audience to be. So you begin with the end in mind. You then ask yourself where they are now, and then you identify your 3 key messages. It's at this point that a lot of people then start writing out a script. My hot tip, don't. Just don't. Don't write yourself a script. Why? Because there's a whole lot of reasons why, actually. One is when you write yourself a script, what do you end up doing? Reading it. And then when you read your script, you completely and utterly lose connection with your audience. The other thing that happens when you write a script is it tends to make you even more nervous. Because believe it or not, when you're nervous, it is harder to read page after page after page of detailed lines than it is to remember your key concepts. So one of the other things that I talk about is frame your thinking, where you use post-it notes. I'm just looking on my desk for an example. Post-it notes to remind you of the key things that you want to talk about. Now, inexperienced and very nervous speakers cannot believe that you can just write a handful of notes on a handful of post-it notes to stay on message. But here's the thing. You wouldn't be talking about a subject. You wouldn't be delivering a speech if you didn't know what you were talking about. No one's ever going to ask me to write a speech or to deliver a speech about beekeeping. I don't need, I'm only ever going to be asked to speak about something that I know a lot about. And so when we just write down a handful of trigger points to remind us of the story that we want to tell, or the key message that we want to deliver, or the example that we want to use, we're able to better connect with our audience and have a conversation, even as a speech, to have a conversation rather than read a script. The other reason why I'm so anti-scripts is because when you lose your place in a script, it's really hard to recover because it actually makes you more nervous. And it happens. You look up from your script, make eye contact, somebody asks you an unexpected question which takes you off course, and then where do you go? Where do you go? And so instead, when you have your notes just mapped out as key deliverables, key messages, key stories, you're able to be more fluid, more conversational, more connected, and more present. I talk a lot about this. In fact, I spell out the entire methodology for framing your thinking, or what is now known by my students as the post-it note method, in episode 74, and it's called Frame Your Thinking. I mentioned that it's become known as the post-it note method by my students, and that is because in both my Impact Club as well as in the Impactful Presenters program, every time we rock up to a group coaching call, my students will say, "Oh my goodness, Kat, I used your post-it note method and it worked." And I'm like, fancy that. We so often, when we're nervous and when we're preparing a speech, we think it's about our words. It's not. It's about our essence. It's about our messages. It's about how we connect with our audience. It's how we make our audience feel. It's how we convey the essence of what it is that we're talking about as distinct to the perfect words. If you're listening or watching, you might have clocked that I am not using a script. This is a conversation with you. I have a couple of points written down about the things that I want to remember. I've got my episode numbers that I want to refer you to. But if I was to have a script, it would sound like an audiobook, maybe, at best, if I'm a good reader, if I'm a good narrator. But when we just have some key points, then we're far able to authentically have a monologue, have a conversation with our audience. So that is where you start when it comes to writing a speech. That is where you start. You begin with the end in mind. Now, if you would like to boost your speaking confidence, if you would like to have the skills, the frameworks, the know-how to show up in the day-to-day conversations that you have in a way that you land your message every single time and that you can confidently handle whatever comes at you, then book in for a confidence boosting curiosity call. I've been teaching and coaching people how to speak with greater authority, authenticity, and confidence for 5 years now. 400 odd people have gone through my Impactful Presenters program. More people have gone through my free program. In fact, thousands have gone through my free programs and my corporate in-house training programs. And so when you have a confidence boosting curiosity call with me, I hear where you're at. I give you my top tips for what you can do literally as we hang up the call, and I will give you my recommended next best steps for how you can show up in the world with greater confidence, authority, authenticity, and impact. So the link to book in that free 20-minute confidence boosting curiosity call is in the show notes, along with the other episodes that I've mentioned and some other resources. Oh, and of course, where to find me on social media. Speaking of which, if you've got a question about this episode, if you would like to simply share this episode with your community, then please do so on your preferred social media platform. You can find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. All of the links are below. And I would be forever grateful if you shared this episode, either on your social media channels or by sharing a review, liking or rating this podcast wherever it is that you're listening, because it's in that way that we get more diverse voices, more diverse people with the confidence to show up, to speak up, and to contribute to the conversations that matter. Until next time, here's to confidence and here's to impact, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon.